look at how we can improve our anothering. That is, how we are called to make Jesus look good by being good to one another. And this is the season of love. We're starting to move into this season of our calendar where we have Valentine's Day, and then you move and you start to have spring show up, then we have Mother's Day and Father's Day. There's all these relationship holidays surrounded in this kind of springtime. And I think it's the perfect time to talk about how we love one another. Because that is the greatest command, that we love one another. Heard a story of a family that invited their preacher over for lunch after worship service. And the mother was in the kitchen busy making the preparation, and she finally got everything ready, and everyone joined at the dinner table, and they asked their 6-year-old daughter to say the prayer of blessing for the food. Well, the 6-year-old, she wasn't prepared, and she got nervous, and she said, "Mom, I don't know what to say." And the mother leaned over and said, just say what you've heard Mommy say. So she closed her eyes and folded her hands and said, "Dear God, why did I ever invite so many people over?" You've been there, haven't you? Because serving others is a lot of work. It's hard to do it, and that's why we avoid it at all costs. I mean, we have created systems where we try to climb the ladder of success so that we don't serve anybody. And this is not a new problem. This is a problem that goes back to the beginning of time. But I want to look at a couple of teachings of Jesus this morning as he calls us to love one another and to submit to one another, and how it is that we can do that. First, let's turn to Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10. You know, Jesus' disciples, they were human. And they were susceptible to these kinds of games. And on one occasion, there were 2 of them that they came up to Jesus on the side, and they wanted to gain special access because of the relationship they had. They were a part of Jesus' inner circle, and they wanted a special gift from him. Well, understandably, this causes some problems once the other disciples find out what they are doing behind their back. So let's start at verse 41 of Mark 10. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them." You understand the way the world works, the way that the government works, is those who have power, they use that power and they lord it over those that are underneath them. So September 9th through September 13th, there was 2 lanes, 2 of the 3 lanes closed that gave access to the George Washington Bridge and to New York City. And it wasn't because anything serious was going on. It was the result of political play. As those in Governor Christie's party, his staff decided to try and get even, and there's some debate on whether or not Governor Christie had knowledge of this, but that was just simply a power play, trying to make life miserable for somebody who didn't agree with them. And we have come to expect. That these kinds of games are going to exist. In fact, in 1975, one of the most popular business books was written by a man by the name of Michael Korda. The book was called Power: How to Get It and to Keep It. And his advice was, and to succeed in the business world, was that you gained as much information as possible and you withheld that from as many people as possible. And that was how you gained success. This is what was taught in the business schools of the day. That you gain information, you gain power, and you use that for your own good, and you withhold that from others around you. Now, the truth is, we learn this from the time that we are children. I always just crack up at my children at the games that they play. Whenever my children get together with their cousins and they get in these arguments over who is taller, because they have already learned that one of the systems that gains somebody a status, gains someone power or authority, is physical. And so if you are taller, if you are bigger, if you are stronger, then you get to decide what games are played. You get to decide how they're played, who's involved. You get the power. And they weren't doing that because they were really curious over who was taller. They were doing that because they wanted to know who was in charge. We play King of the Mountain as children. And we just kind of create these games, and we think that we kind of mature above that, but the reality is we just change the names of the games. So the games that we play don't involve physical stature as much as they may involve physical beauty. So we invest all of this money, all of this time in maintaining our physical beauty. Trying to fight this war of death that is creeping on us, and we're all going to die, and its effects are slowly showing itself on our bodies every single day, but we try and fight it off because those who are younger, those who are more beautiful, those are the ones that succeed. Maybe it's not physical at all. Maybe it's material for you. Maybe it's the size of house that you have. Maybe it's the car that you drive. Maybe it's the neighborhood that you live in. Maybe it's the school that you attended, or that your children now attend, that you're able to give them this status. See, we have all these kinds of systems in place that all they are designed to do is to make us feel important, to give us some kind of identity, some kind of status. And when those systems are threatened, we will fight. Sometimes it's just verbally, but whenever it comes down to it, we will fight physically, even to the death, to maintain the system that is at play as long as we are in charge. Jesus says that's the way that the world works. But he's going to say in the very next verse, verse 43, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great. And what he's doing is he's not giving another system. He's flipping the system that the world functions on its head. He says, if you want to be great, this is what you need to know. If you want to be great, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Must be slave of all. Which is okay, as long as you don't treat me like a slave. Then it's hard. To be a servant of all, you need another love. You need to take your identity from somewhere else in order to give up your identity in whatever system it is that the world is valuing at that time, to give that up, you need to draw your identity from some other place. And so Jesus models this for his disciples in John chapter 13. In John chapter 13, he's gathered his disciples on that last evening for one last meal. Verse 1. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. I don't know at what point Jesus was cognitively aware that he was God. I mean, it's kind of hard to fathom that as an infant with the embryonic fluid still on his skin, that he was cognitively aware that he was God. I don't know at what point he really became aware of that. But here John makes it very clear that at this point, Jesus knows. He knows that he came from God. He knows that he's going back to God. He knows who he is. And John is laying this groundwork before he goes into telling what the story is, because that's essential to understanding how it is that Jesus does what Jesus is about to do. So Jesus knows that he is the most important man in that room. He is the most important voice. What do you do when all eyes are looking at you? When everyone that is gathered in that room, that they're all waiting to hear something from you, and it's what you say that is going to impact the rest of their life, that you hold that much sway in their lives. What is it that you do? Anita Smith found herself in this position a little over a year ago, as her husband, Ronnie, was a 33-year-old chemistry teacher from Austin, Texas. They had gone over and served in Benghazi, teaching there. And on one day, 4 unidentified men pulled up in a black Jeep and killed Ronnie. And here is Anita, now widowed with a young child, at the hands of what we call in American media the forces of evil. The axis of evil. I mean, that's the terminology that we put on these people. And everybody was, just waiting at Anita's door. She had all kinds of interview requests, wanting to hear from her, because now, all of a sudden, her voice, and people never had heard of her before, but now the world wants to know what she has to say in the midst of her grief, what we should do, how we should respond. She had an interview with Anderson Cooper, and for about 5 minutes, she tells Anderson, as now her voice is what carries throughout the room. She said, I have no idea who these men are, but I want them to know that I love them, that I forgive them, that Jesus loves them. And if you were to watch the interview, you could see Anderson Cooper is just stunned. He's there in disbelief. And he asked her 3 or 4 times. He said, I understand, people eventually get to this point, months later, but here we are. We're not even 2 days removed from this. How can you say that you love them and that you forgive him, "How can you say that so soon?" And all she can say is, "I guess God has put this on my heart, that somehow the Spirit has been moving me to say this." Somehow she has another love that allows her to submit, to put herself under those who in reality are her enemy. What Jesus does when he is the most important one in the room, when he understands that he is from God, that he's returning to God. Verse 4, "So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist, and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, 'Lord, are you going to wash my feet?'" You got to understand, Peter is not objecting because he doesn't believe that his feet need to be washed. It was understood that whenever you're living in this dry, arid climate and you're wearing sandals and you walk everywhere, that before you eat, and in a culture where you eat reclined, and so your feet is next to somebody else's food, that you want your feet to be washed. You want everybody's feet to be washed. So he's not objecting because he doesn't think his feet need to be washed. He's objecting because he doesn't want Jesus to wash his feet. Because what you don't understand is that washing of feet was such a demeaning, such a disgusting job that it was not just any person that was allowed to do this. We have no record of a Jewish man washing any of his family's feet. We have a couple of records from this point in the historical record of a wife that out of her deep devotion for her husband that will wash them. We have only a couple of occurrences of that. There are only a few times that we have record of a Jewish slave being allowed to wash a Jewish master's feet. This job was relegated to the foreign slaves, the outsiders. It's too dirty of a job to allow people of your own kind to do this. We still experience that in America. There are jobs that are too physically demanding, too physically demeaning, that if you live in America for a certain period of time, you don't allow your children to enter into those fields. We relegate those to the outsiders, those that don't look like us, those that don't share the same values as us. We kind of shove those to the side as if we just want to get rid of those people and those jobs. We don't want to look at somebody that's like us doing that kind of work. We still have that. And that's why it was such an appalling thing for Peter to look at someone that he calls Lord and Master to get down on his knees and to wash his feet. Jesus is modeling what Paul will teach. Paul will use the word submission. To submit yourself. That was a phrase that you used to hear a lot in weddings. In Ephesians 5, verse 22, Paul tells wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. And you used to hear, there was a time where you would hear that the wives in the weddings, they were given this charge to submit and to obey, but we don't use that language anymore. It's too archaic, it's too hierarchical, it's too patriarchal. It's out of date. But you can't get away from the force of the language that Paul is using whenever he is calling the wives husbands' desires, their needs above their own. To submit themselves to their husbands. He says this pleases the Lord. You can't argue yourself around the force of that language that he's saying, that you're to essentially be a slave to your husband. I can feel all the stinging stares coming from half of the audience right now. But before the men get too comfortable, what you need to understand is that Paul begins this section. In Ephesians 5, verse 21, he says that you are to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Before he moves in to address the wives, he's talking to the entire church, and he says that everyone, all of you, you're to submit to one another. So husbands, you're to submit to your wives. You're supposed to put your wives' desires and wishes and wants and needs above your own wants and wishes and desires and needs. You're to become a slave of your wife. What Paul is wanting is that adults, you submit yourselves to children. That the wealthy, you submit yourselves to the poor. That the healthy, you submit yourselves to those who are sick, those who are handicapped. That everyone is submitting themselves to each other. And it flows out of them that he says, why submit yourselves to your husbands? It's costly. It's almost impossible to do unless you derive your identity, your sense of self-worth from somewhere else. You need another love. Because this system will work as long as it's reciprocal, but it breaks down and fails whenever your child refuses to submit to you. That's when it breaks down for wives. They don't have a problem submitting to their husbands until their husbands stop submitting to them. That's whenever the system breaks down. That's when all of a sudden we become so needy, so desperate, that then we just start to begin to do things only for ourselves and try and fill ourselves up. And that's when our relationships break down. Because we're dependent upon them to fill us. See, Jesus had another love, and that's how he was able to submit. Before Jesus ever begins and does anything in his ministry, there's this verse in Matthew 3, verse 17. Whenever he is baptized, the heavens open up, and a voice from heaven says, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." He had another love. He could serve other people because he didn't need their love, their acceptance. He didn't need anything from them. His self-worth was secure in however they received his service. And that's also, I think, why Paul, before he says, "Wives, submit to your husbands," before he says, "Submit to one another," he gives this command in Ephesians 5, verse 18. He says, "Don't get drunk with wine. Instead, be filled with the Holy Spirit." The only command from Ephesians 5, verse 18 through verse 21, the only active verb is to be filled. Everything else that occurs in there, the singing to one another, the teaching one another, submitting to one another, all of those are participles. And I know that most of us aren't up on our English grammar, but a participle is it's a verbal adjective. What that means is that it is a verb that functions as an adjective. It's describing something. So whenever you're trying to understand what Paul really has in mind, what he's really concerned about, you look for the verb, what he's wanting you to do. What he's wanting you to do is to be filled with the Spirit. And everything else that ends in an ing in the rest of those verses is simply describing somebody who is filled with the Spirit. He's saying that those who are able to submit themselves to one another, that is exemplary of a person who is filled with something else. To submit to another is to receive another love. That's how Jesus was able to humble himself and wash his disciples' feet. That's how Anita was able to humble herself and give up, forfeit her right for vengeance and justice, and offer grace and mercy, and to put the well-being of somebody else who was her enemy above herself, is because the Spirit had put that on her. She was filled with another love. Princess Alice, daughter of Queen Victoria, was also filled with another love. Princess Alice's children had contracted a deadly illness, diphtheria. She was warned by the doctors of that time to stay away from her kids, and she did, until she overheard one of her young sons whispering to a nurse, "Why doesn't my mom kiss me anymore?" When she heard that, she rushed over and showered that boy with kisses. Within a few days, both of them died. And she could do that because she was consumed with another love. That's really a perfect example of the sacrifice that Jesus made. That he loved so much, and just because that is who he is, God is love, John will say, that he came down and he loved so much that it ultimately led to his death. He submitted so much that he was crucified because of his submission. I got to ask you, church, knowing that you are loved by another love that much, how can you not submit to one another? We're going to sing a song just a moment, Living for Jesus. How can you not live your life for somebody who has given everything up for you? You are free to not care how somebody receives you. It doesn't matter if they give the love back to you, because your love tank is already filled up. You are overflowing. You're not drunk on wine. You are drunk on the Spirit. You are overflowing, and the Spirit just flows out of you. Will you receive that love? If you need to receive that love, why don't you come as we sing this again?